I felt compelled to appear before you today because these important measures are at risk. The Conservative Party, enabled and supported by the Bloc and the NDP, are obstructing the work Canadians elected each of us to do by bringing this Parliament to a complete standstill. As we speak, the chamber upstairs, they are blocking vital legislation that will deliver clean water to Indigenous communities, funding to build affordable housing, and funding for healthcare and dental care. The NDP used to say that they were a party of workers, but they are now supporting the Conservatives in blocking the $3 million needed to give workers a seat at the table through the Sustainable Jobs Act. Le Bloc québécois se souciait.
The Bloc Québécois used to care about Quebec's forestry sector, but are now supporting the Conservatives, blocking over $4 million of critical funding to fight the forest fires that have harmed our forest industry.
The party, after years of ignoring Indigenous rights and voices, are blocking over $13 million for the important work of the Indigenous Advisory Monitoring Committee. And together, these parties are blocking funding for the Smart Renewables program, a program that is helping to build affordable, reliable, and clean electricity grids. Colleagues, I urge you all to support the estimates as presented and to ask you to each stand against Pierre Poilievre's ridiculous obstruction that is wasting millions of taxpayer dollars, so that we can adopt this funding that will strengthen our economy and fight climate change. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you for your opening remarks, Minister Wilkinson. And now I will go to our first round of questioning, which starts with Ms. Stubbs. Ms. Stubbs, you have 6 minutes and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister and officials, for being here. Minister, it just strikes me, everything that you just talked about, it seems to suggest that you yourself haven't been in power for 9 years. And I guess the obvious question for most Canadians would be, well, how do you imagine that any of us are supposed to believe that any of those things are priorities for you when after 9 years you haven't got any of it done? And if you're so confident, now you want to fight the Conservatives, you want to fight the NDP, you want to fight whoever, then just call a carbon tax election and let Canadians actually make this decision for once and for all. But I just have a general question to start with you. You know, if you're a seller of a product, do you believe that having more customers is better than having one?
Thank you, honourable member. I would say we have been in power for 9 years. We've made enormous progress. The Smart Renewables program, for example, actually has 71 different projects that have actually generated 2,700 megawatts of power. But what Canadians want to understand is why you are obstructing the work of Parliament, why Parliament is wasting millions of dollars doing almost nothing every day because the Conservatives simply obstruct everything that's happening.
Minister Wilkinson, we have a point of order. I'll ask you to hold 1 second. Go ahead on a point of order, Mr. Bruson.
I'm just asking, the Minister was providing an answer and Ms. Stubbs kept on interrupting. It makes it really hard to actually hear the answer.
So, Mr. Bruson, thank you for a point of order, and I'm glad we've been able to raise this right off the top because we want to make sure that the individuals asking the questions ask the questions and the minister has appropriate time to provide an answer. And I would hope that members do not interrupt the individual asking the question, but also the minister who's responding to the question asked. So if you can give him an appropriate amount of time to do so, I think that would be greatly appreciated, and we'll have a smooth meeting accordingly. Thank you, Mr. Bruson, on a point of order, and I am, do you have a point of order, Mr. Falk?
Yes, on a related point of order, I think when the minister's asked a succinct question, he should give a succinct answer.
So, Mr. Falk, thank you for your point of order. I'd like to acknowledge that he was just getting into giving an answer before he was cut off. So I want to make sure that we have the ability to ask and answer. I will go back to you, Ms. Stubbs.
Sorry, point of order.
Sorry, we have a point of order from Mr. Angus.
I don't want to give anybody advice with my old gray hair, but my Conservative colleagues keep ruining their clips by doing points of order. I'd say let's just carry on.
Thank you.
Minister, do you believe it's better to have more customers than one? Minister, do you believe it's better to have more customers than one?
It's exactly the reason why we actually built the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which you folks couldn't actually get built, is to ensure that we actually had access to Tidewater to be able to actually sell our products to other markets.
So after 9 years, what actually happened is in the first 2 years of your government, you killed the 2 private sector proposed dedicated export pipelines. One to be able to export to Asia, one to the East Coast, which would have secured energy self-sufficiency for Canadians and secure export markets in Europe. In fact, TMX now has only just started operating, and within 5 years, Canada will be out of pipeline capacity altogether. It is because of your policies that Canada now in 2023 is still dependent on the US as a number one customer for oil and gas, while the US since 2015 in every Democrat, then Republican, then Democrat, then Republican administration has turned the United States from a net importer of oil into a net exporter, Canada's biggest competitor, while because of your anti-development policies, they are still Canada's biggest customer. How can you be proud of a track record that helps create jobs and build pipelines, sends money and investment into the United States while leaving Canadians broke, poor, and jobless?
Well, I would say it's a sad state of affairs when a representative of a political party that actually couldn't get anything built in this country is actually making that kind of an argument. At the end of the day, the Conservative Party gutted environmental protections such that nothing could actually get built in this country. They lost social license. They lost the ability to work with Indigenous peoples. It was this government, through the work that we did very proactively, particularly on the Indigenous side, that actually managed to get the Trans Mountain Pipeline built, but also major projects across this country.
Except you killed the Northern Gateway Pipeline, of which every single Indigenous community supported and had mutual benefit agreements that you took all away from them when the Prime Minister vetoed it without any consultation. Can you at least by now answer the question, how many oil and gas jobs will your one of its kind in the world production cap kill?
It's going to create tens of thousands of jobs in Alberta when you actually are going to see large-scale CCUS projects that are going to be built in Alberta, that are going to be operated in Alberta, methane reduction technologies that have already driven significant job growth in Alberta. You are going to see significant job creation associated with the path. And that is exactly why you hear from workers that they actually think this is a good thing, rather than letting companies that are making enormous profits simply distributed back to shareholders.
Minister,
this is actually going to ensure they invested in Canada.
You're talking about jobs in the future. 300,000 Canadians since 2015 have already lost their oil and gas jobs because of your policies. The Conference Board of Canada, S&P Global, and Deloitte says your first of its kind in the world, not a cause for celebration, but instead a cause for caution, says your cap will kill between 100 to 150,000 jobs over the next 15 years. So I guess the question is simple then. Do you believe the Conference Board of Canada, S&P Global, Deloitte, the Canadian Chambers of Commerce, and all of the other experts and economists who have come out to say your oil and gas cap, exactly as you intended to do, will kill hundreds of thousands of jobs? Do you think they're wrong?
I do, actually. They were basing their analysis, first of all, on a regulation that didn't even exist. Second of all, one of the assumptions they made was that oil and gas companies would do nothing to reduce their emissions. The only person who in this room, or the only people in this room who actually think that's a reasonable thing to say, are the climate deniers who maybe sit on the Conservative benches. But I would say, Paul, an oil sands worker from Fort McMurray, said, the oil and gas companies are taking our money and bringing it out of the province right now. All these companies are just raking in the money, taking it away where it can be invested. If it's a pollution cap, if it's carbon capture, there you go. That's an investment. That's more money that you keep here. And that is exactly right.
Minister, you mentioned Indigenous opportunities and jobs, and I certainly have been an advocate over the past 10 years since I've been elected for job opportunities and economic prosperity for Indigenous people, reconciling action so they can move from surviving poverty to thriving in prosperity for the benefit of the entire country. Do you know how many Indigenous people are employed in Canada's oil and gas sector?
There are many, as there are in Canada's mining sector, and I would say that's an extremely good thing. But I would say, once again, we're here because the blockage in Parliament to be able to get the SUPS-B approved means that you're actually looking to kill the Indigenous Advisory Committee, something that has been enormously important for the oil and gas sector, and that's something you should reflect on, and so should your leader.
Minister, up to almost 10% of the oil and gas sector jobs are filled by Indigenous people. Those are the people most at risk
Ms.
of
Stubbs,
your anti-energy policies.
Time's up. You'll have to continue that line of questioning in the next round. Stubbs, you have 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. So just to finish off where we were, Minister, 13,000 Indigenous people, of course, work in jobs in the energy sector. As you know, Indigenous people make up about 4% of the national workforce, but 8% of the energy sector. Indigenous people make 3 times more in the oil and gas sector than they do in other sectors. Indigenous women in particular make very much more than others in other sectors. There are lower unemployment among Indigenous people in the oil and gas sector than the rest of the economy. And so I just wonder, how is it that knowing that the oil and gas cap, because every expert says so, will kill hundreds of thousands of Canadian oil and gas jobs, how can you possibly justify bringing through policies that will kill the jobs, the livelihoods, and the future aspirations of those people you always say you care about most?
Well, I mean, Ms. Stubbs, that's just factually untrue. And in fact, the way in which the oil and gas cap is defined is we expect to see a 16% increase in production, not a decrease in production, an increase in employment, not a decrease in employment. And we've brought forward mechanisms like the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program, which is sector agnostic, to ensure that Indigenous people can participate not just as workers in the sector, but as owners in the sector. That is absolutely a fundamental part of what we are working to do.
Minister, your claims that it will create jobs and increase production make just absolutely no sense, because after 9 years, your government has left Canada completely landlocked, dependent on one customer, the United States, which is now our biggest competitor. Within 5 years, Canada will be completely out of pipeline capacity. Therefore, production will be cut. Therefore, oil and gas workers will lose jobs. Therefore, a priority group among them who will be hurt the most will be Indigenous workers in oil and gas. It is deeply alarming that the Natural Resources Minister of Canada seems to have no clue about that. And I guess then you don't really care that Dale Swampy from the National Coalition of Chiefs says, quote, if the federal government continues on its path with C-50, a just transition, which you know will kill 170,000 oil and gas jobs immediately, because your own memos told you so, and he says an emissions cap, which is a productions cap, and other crippling legislation will cause an energy crisis that will have catastrophic effects on our people, especially those living on reserves across the country. Shame on you. But let's talk about LNG, because of course it's you and your government who seem to be the only people in the world who think there's no business case for Canadian LNG. How many countries, Minister, have asked for LNG from Canada?
First of all, I would say it's the
How
height
many
of
countries
hypocrisy
have asked for
for a
LNG
member
from
of a party
Canada?
that actually could never get a pipeline to Tidewater built to actually be saying
Four
that we're
pipelines were
somehow
built
at
under
fault for the
Canada,
fact that there's
under
actually
the
still a
former
significant
Conservative
amount of
government.
oil going to the United States. We are the first government that actually was able to get a pipeline built, and that's because we respect the
actually
environment
killed
and
the
we
two
respect
private
Indigenous
sector
peoples, unlike the
proposals
conservative,
to
the
export
Harper
markets
conservative governments, which
that were
did not respect
proposed
either.
under the former
Minister
Conservative
Wilkinson, I'm
government.
asking you to hold there. Colleagues, we need to have one individual speaking at a time, the individual asking the question, and the minister to have an opportunity to answer the question, because it makes it very difficult for our interpreters to interpret when we have multiple microphones on and multiple folks speaking. So please feel free to ask your question, but please provide the minister enough time to provide a response.
Great. The question
so I'm
was
gonna go
how
back
many
to you.
great. The question was how many countries have asked Canada for LNG? That's a real-
There have been 6 LNG projects that have actually proceeded to the decision stage during the 9
How
years
many
we've been in government.
countries have
5
asked
have been
Canada for
approved.
LNG?
One that was rejected by the government of Quebec.
The answer is 7 countries have asked for LNG from Canada: Germany, Poland, Japan, Ukraine, South Korea, Greece, and Latvia. Your prime minister, your government said there is no business case. So in fact, Canada is exporting 0 LNG right now. But in the exact same time that you guys have been in government, the U.S., of course, has skyrocketed ahead to export LNG. Then the Biden administration announced a pause. You still dithered and delayed and roadblocked Canadian LNG out of Canada. Mexico went to race ahead. Now, in addition to the tariffs that Trump is threatening on Canada, he has also said they're going to ramp up exporting LNG again. How on earth, Minister, can you justify your anti-development and anti-energy policy that send $500 billion in businesses and investment from Canada to the United States, creates jobs, builds critical infrastructure, helps export from the United States while landlocking Canada, killing our GDP, doubling housing costs, doubling food bank uses, skyrocketing the costs of all essentials, and killing Canadian jobs?
I mean, it would be nice if you would actually use some facts, Ms. Stubb. There are 3 LNG projects that are actually in the process of being built right now. One is LNG
Correct,
Canada
which
1,
means
the
none are
second is
being
wood fiber,
exported.
the third is Cedar LNG. With respect to the East
Zero is
Coast,
being
the East Coast
exported.
opportunity, I would suggest that you read the newspaper because it was Repsol and TC Energy who actually said that there was no economics because the infrastructure costs of getting that amount of gas to the East Coast actually meant that the price of gas would not be competitive. That was a business decision by businesses.
And you
Thank
killed
you,
pipelines to the East
Ms.
Coast.
Stubbs.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks, Chair. Thanks again, Minister. After 9 years and 3 presidents, your government still hasn't reached a softwood lumber agreement with the United States. It's resulted in softwood lumber tariffs on Canada doubling to over 14%. Now there's a possibility it could be a further 11% increase. What do you have to say to the hundreds of workers, particularly in Quebec and BC, but right across the country, who have already lost their jobs?
I would say it's obviously a very difficult and very challenging set of issues. The U.S. administration, Republican or Democrat, have been very, very challenging to deal with on this file for a whole range of different reasons. We continue to look for a negotiated agreement with the Americans, and we will continue to do that. We have put in place measures, including in the last budget, about $350 million to actually support the forest sector, and we're looking at what more we can do. I certainly have met with all of the major companies, and the Minister of International
Thank you,
Trade,
Minister.
who leads on this, is also doing that.
It is wild, of course, given the former Conservative government got a softwood lumber deal done within months, and actually, in fact, right before you took over, got an extension done. Now, the committee next door is actually doing a study on softwood lumber, so since you don't seem to have anything to say to the workers who are losing their jobs, let me tell you what they're actually saying. The United Steelworkers says the impact of the last 8 years has been far-reaching, wide, and devastating. Steel, in terms of our sector, steelworkers, 2,500 to 3,000 jobs have been impacted. They say they haven't been feeling that softwood lumber is a priority for your government. Groupe LaBelle says, since hearing news on the tariffs, they looked at their client base and what they thought was acceptable to them. And guess what? Just as is the pattern of your government driving money, jobs, and businesses into the United States to the expense of Canadians, they say American clients are 50% of their business. And if things don't work out on the market side, they could lose much of that. 800 workers could be affected by these tariffs for their company, Groupe LaBelle, alone. So what are you actually going to do? And really, what do you have to say to all the Canadians and to our entire country that you have made so vulnerable to the United States?
Oh, where to start? I mean, the ridiculous nature of the questions that you've been posing today, I just
don't
have a
think
hard
this is
time
cause for
even beginning to
laughing
respond
or
to them. But
smiling
at the
or
end of the day,
chuckling
this
from your
is
liberal
an
colleagues
important
at
issue. It's
all.
an important issue for folks who work in the forestry
Point of
industry.
order.
It's an important issue for the companies in the forestry sector.
Mr. Wilkinson, Minister Wilkinson, a point of order from Mr. Patzer. Mr. Patzer on a point of order.
Yeah, I think the record shows that Mr. Wilkinson thinks United Steelworkers are a joke, which is crazy.
Mr. Patzer, that's not a point of order. That's a point of, I think, debate, and you do not have authority to debate right now. Minister, yes, go ahead. Mr. Bruce.
I think that was an inappropriate use of a point of order, and just to be clear, the record does not show that at all. So let's be clear, that is not
So,
what happened.
thank you,
Well, he
Ms.
just started laughing and so did you
DeBrussen,
guys.
on your point of order. That was not a point of order, and thank you for recognizing it
Actions
wasn't.
versus words.
I'm going to go to you, Minister Wilkinson. We have like 15, 20 seconds left, so you can finish off your answer to that.
The forestry sector is obviously a very important sector, and there are many communities, certainly many in the province that I come from, of British Columbia, that actually have been suffering because of the softwood lumber issue. As I say, the Government of Canada has put in place a number of programs, including value-added forestry
We don't
work,
have a
to try to
deal,
actually
and none of your
ensure that we are
spin
moving
jobs here
forward, and we
matters.
are engaging the Americans, and we will continue to work as hard
So
as
while
we possibly
Canada
can
faces
to get a deal with the United States
threats
that's a
of
good deal
tariffs
for Canada.
from the
Thank
United
you.
States, are you
Thank you,
still actually
Minister
going to quadruple the
Wilkinson,
carbon
and
tax on
thank
Canadians
you,
in April?
Ms. Stubbs.